The road was empty, as it always was at this time of day. The police patrol car rolled slowly along the faded asphalt, soaked in the sweltering heat. Officer Bryant, weary from the endless monotony of duty, was lazily looking around when he noticed a strange figure in the distance. On the roadside, under a dusty tree, stood a woman in a wheelchair. She held the reins of a large but gaunt horse tightly. The horse was shifting nervously from foot to foot, shaking its head as if it sensed something wrong. The woman in the wheelchair was staring off into the distance, her face covered by a wide-brimmed hat. But even from a distance, Bryant sensed that her presence was unusual. The officer slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. A thought flashed through his mind. What is she doing here alone? This was an abandoned stretch of highway where not a single person could be seen all day. Why was a woman in a wheelchair out here, and even with a horse? His inner voice, cold and indifferent, added, "Something is wrong." "Hey!" Bryant called out, getting out of the car and adjusting his belt and holster. "What are you doing here?" The woman slowly turned her head in his direction. Under her hat, she could see tired eyes and a weathered face. She said nothing, just continued to hold the reins. Bryant felt an irritation that quickly turned to dislike. He took the woman's silence as a challenge. "I said, 'What are you doing here?'" He repeated louder, adding a note of authority to his voice. Everyone had to obey his questions, he thought. "It's none of your business, officer." Her voice was quiet but firm. She wasn't going to apologize for being here. Bryant stepped closer, examining the horse. The animal looked haggard, its coat piled in places and its ribs showing through. He shifted his gaze to the woman. Her hands were calloused, and her wheelchair looked old and worn, as if it had been used for decades. This picture suddenly made him even angrier. Everything about her seemed ridiculous and wrong to him. The woman in the wheelchair, the pathetic horse, her persistent silence. "Do you realize you have no right to leave an animal in that condition?" Bryant took a step closer to looming over her. "It's animal abuse. Do you realize you have no right to interrogate me?" The woman raised her head, her eyes flashing with anger. "I have more rights on this earth than you do." Bryant froze. Her response was unexpected. He was used to people being afraid of his uniform, his badge, but this woman, confined to a wheelchair in the middle of a deserted road with a tired animal, was looking at him as an equal, maybe even contemptuous. It infuriated him to the point of rage. "You know what?" His voice turned icy. "I'm going to find out what you're doing here, even if I have to use force." Taking the radio, he pretended to call for backup, but continued to glare at her. The woman lowered her head again, as if returning to her thoughts, and that only made him more annoyed. He felt she was challenging him, her, sitting in an old wheelchair with a pathetic horse, and he couldn't stand it. This meeting, before it had even begun, was already saturated with tension. Bryant had no idea that this woman would change his whole life. Officer Bryant glared at the woman in the wheelchair with a gaze that would have seemed intense had it not been for the latent hatred that burned in his eyes. His thoughts, as if poisoned with venom, overflowed with contempt. She looked to him like something unnecessary, burdensome, disruptive. Why do people like her even exist? He thought. Bryant grew up in a family where respect came only through strength, and poverty was not just a weakness, but a vice. His father repeatedly said, "If you're sick or broken, it's your own fault." Those words had become his dogma, and now there stood before him a woman who, in his opinion, embodied everything he despised, helplessness, poverty, and defiance. "Where did you even come from?" he snorted, trying to jab her. "You look like you escaped from some slum, or maybe you should have stayed where you were born." His words were like knives, but the woman didn't even blink. Her face remained icily calm, but her hands, clenched on the armrests of the wheelchair, trembled slightly. She knew this was the beginning of an attack that was all too familiar to her. "I have as much right to be here as anyone else, officer," she replied calmly, but her voice was taut as a string. "Right?" He laughed, a laugh that sounded of outright contempt. "Your right ends where my road begins. You're like trash on the side of the road. Look at you. A wheelchair, a horse that looks like it's going to die in a couple miles. Do you even realize how pathetic that is?" Her face flushed, but she didn't take her eyes away. "He who tries to prove his greatness by humiliating others is pathetic," she replied, and there was confidence in her words. Bryant felt his anger boil over. She dared to defy him? She, this woman in a wheelchair, dared to speak to him as if they were equals? It was unacceptable. "Look, miss," his voice became cold, almost threatening. "If you think your wheelchair gives you the right to talk to me like that, you're sorely mistaken. You are nothing, just a shadow. And you know what's funny? People like you are always whining about your rights, but in reality, you're just making it harder for normal people to live." The woman squinted, her voice hard. "Normal people? You mean the ones who think their badge and gun gives them the right to be tyrants?" His face twitched. He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. The horse snorted alarmingly and took a step to the side, but the reins were clutched firmly in her hands. "You're already out of line," he hissed. "You think you can talk to me any way you want? You think your leg problems give you an advantage? Let's be honest. No one wants you. No one would even notice if you disappeared from this road." The words were an icy blow. The woman pressed her lips together, trying not to let her emotions come out. Her hands gripped the armrests of the wheelchair a little tighter. She looked at him as if she could see right through him, down to the very depths of his ugly soul. "You're too confident in your power, officer," she said quietly, but there was a threat in her words. "But the evil you sow always comes back. Always." His face contorted into a wicked smile. "Is that so? Then let's see how lucky you'll be when this road is left for normal people only. The horse or you, I don't know what's more pathetic." Her silence was more eloquent than any words. Bryant saw her breathing quicken, her eyes grow moist, but she didn't let the tears spill. It irritated him even more. He wanted to break her, to show her who was in charge, and he didn't know that this moment would be the point of no return. Before we continue with this story, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from, and if something similar has happened in your life. We appreciate your thoughts and experiences. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next exciting episodes. And now we continue. Silence spilled over the road, but it was not peace. It was a taut string that could break at any moment. Police Officer Bryant stood over a woman in a wheelchair who held an icy calm that only fueled his inner rage. She was vulnerable, but not broken, and that infuriated him. "Okay," he said, taking a step back, but his voice sounded as if he'd already made up his mind. "You seem to have something that needs to be dealt with." The woman frowned, her fingers gripping the armrests of the wheelchair tighter. She felt the tension around her become almost palpable. "What are you talking about?" Her voice remained firm, but there was a note of caution in it. Bryant smirked, his face contorted with a gloating expression. "About your inspection. You know, I remembered seeing a horse similar to yours on a cattle theft report a couple weeks ago. I think it wasn't too far from here." "Yeah, that's right. Just as pathetic and haggard as this one. Looks like I'm going to have to keep you." "What?" She looked shocked, but quickly pulled herself together. "You know very well it's a lie." "Lies?" Bryant took a step forward, leaning in close to her face. "So, you're accusing me, a police officer, of lying? You think I'd lie to deal with someone like you?" Her eyes flashed with anger, but she held herself in check. "You're using your position to intimidate me. But I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper, but each letter cut like a blade. "You're not afraid?" He laughed a short, harsh laugh. "We'll see about that." Bryant stepped to his car, picked up his notebook, and returned to the woman. He opened it with a theatrical look, beginning to write something down quickly, occasionally casting cold glances at her. "Failure to produce animal documents, violation of public order, disobedience to a police officer. That's just the beginning," he added with a smile, clicking his pen. "And if I find anything else, believe me, the list will be longer." The woman stared at him, her face remaining calm, but a storm raging inside her. She realized it was a game. He wanted to crush her, to break her, to make her submit. "You know it's all a lie," she finally said, breaking the silence. "You use the uniform to cover your dirty deeds. That's not power, that's cowardice." The words hit the target like stones. Bryant's face darkened, his fists clenched. He was ready to scream at her, but he stopped himself. An idea flashed through his mind, something more sinister. "Are you saying I'm a coward? All right, then we'll see what the law says when they take you to the station." His voice turned icy. "With your comfortable wheelchair, it's going to be an unforgettable trip." He stepped toward the horse and yanked the reins sharply from its hands. The animal jerked fearfully, but Bryant held it firmly. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice. You can't—" Her voice was harsh, but he interrupted her. "I can do anything I want, and you'll find out." The woman looked at him, her face impassive, but her eyes spoke of pain. He stood before her, enjoying his false victory, not realizing that this moment would be the beginning of his downfall. The dusty air was filled with oppressive tension. Police Officer Bryant stood next to the woman in the wheelchair, studying her face with a cold, almost animalistic grin. He could see the fear that tried to hide behind her hard stare. That fear was a source of pleasure for him, proof of his superiority. He wanted more. He wanted to break her. "You know," he began, stepping back a few paces as if thinking about something, "sometimes people like you just don't understand words. Maybe it's time I taught you a lesson you'll never forget." Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't answer. The horse, as if sensing the impending evil, moved its ears restlessly, stomping its hooves. Bryant smirked. "Lesson number 1. You cannot be equal to the likes of me," he continued, looking straight into her eyes. "Lesson number 2. Your world ends where my law begins." He grabbed the horse's reins sharply, pulling the animal behind him. The woman in the wheelchair tried to squeeze the reins, but his grip was stronger. "What are you doing?" Her voice trailed off, but there was a steely defiance in it. "I'll show you what happens to those who think they are above their fate," he replied, without even turning around. His steps grew more confident, and her helplessness only fueled his determination. He pulled his horse toward the rails that crossed the road a few dozen meters from where they had collided. The warm metal of the rails glistened in the midday sun as if to portend trouble. "Stop!" the woman shouted, her voice breaking the silence, but Bryant didn't stop. "This is inhumane. You have no right." "Right?" He cast a glance over his shoulder, smiling. "Your rights end where my power begins." He reached the rail, dropped the reins, and pulled a thick rope from the car. The woman, trying to stay on the ground of reason, screamed again. "That horse is my life. She's done nothing to you. Just as the thousands whose lives ended at this crossroads had done nothing. It's just life, baby," he replied with a cold chuckle, tying the rope to one of the animal's legs. The horse twitched, but Bryant was strong. He squeezed its head and quickly tightened the knot, then secured the other end of the rope to the rail. It was his moment of triumph. His power was absolute and her helplessness complete. "Stop it!" she shouted, pushing her arms as hard as she could, trying to roll the wheelchair closer to the tracks. "You're out of your mind. This is cruelty." "Cruelty?" He laughed again, leaning into her face until she could look away. "It's just a reality you can never deal with. You sit in your wheelchair and think the world owes you something. But it doesn't. Not to anyone." She froze for a moment, her body trembling with impotent rage. She knew she wouldn't be able to untie the rope in time. The train was already audible in the distance, a low rumbling sound on the tracks filling the air with vibration. "You still have a chance to stop." Her voice was choked, but she was still talking. "This is your last chance to prove you're human, not a monster." His face contorted into a grim grin. He stepped closer, looking directly into her eyes. "I choose to be who I want to be. Now you see how the world deals with your weakness." The noise of the approaching train grew louder and louder. She shouted her pleas, but his face remained stony. She reached for the rope, her hands shaking with tension, but she couldn't reach it. The train appeared on the horizon, a huge, merciless force that knew no pity. She screamed one last time, but the sound of the train drowned out her voice. All that was left was a silent scream as the train slammed into the horse. The silence that followed was deafening. The rails vibrated, echoing in the silence that hung over the deserted road. The sound of the train grew louder and louder, the thud of the metal wheels echoing through the dry air. A woman in a wheelchair darted her gaze between the approaching train and her horse chained to the tracks. Her eyes burned with a desperate plea, but she realized that her efforts were powerless against the man's cruelty. "You can't do this," she shouted, tearing her voice that cut her throat painfully. "This is murder, you monster." Police Officer Bryant stood aside, arms folded across his chest. His face was as if carved from stone, not the slightest hint of emotion. His gaze was one of superiority and cold contempt. "Murder?" He stretched out with a chuckle. "Murder is when a human being is killed. This is just an animal, weak and useless like its mistress." Those words were like a spit in her soul. She clenched her eyes for a moment to keep from screaming, but the train was inexorably approaching, and she had no time for despair. She pushed the wheelchair forward with all her might, the wheels crunching under the pressure of the gravel, but the distance to the tracks seemed endless. "Help! Somebody help me!" Her scream broke the silence, but it was empty. Not a single car, not a single passerby, just her horse, and Bryant, standing like a judge watching the inevitable. The horse thrashed in place, pulling on the rope, but the knots were too tight. Her big, frightened eyes glistened with tears, and her mouth was foaming with impotent tension. She struggled and snorted, but each attempt to free herself only made her more tangled. "Are you still trying?" Bryant threw, stepping closer to enjoy her helplessness. "Maybe you don't realize that no one's coming. No one wants people like you. You're just a mistake of nature." The woman gritted her teeth, her hands gripping the armrests of the wheelchair so tightly that her fingers turned white. She hated him, but hate couldn't change anything. The train was already too close. Its roar filled the whole place, drowning out her screams. She reached forward again, her fingers trying to reach the rope, but her wheelchair was too heavy to get close fast enough. Time was stretching out. The rumble of metal and the growing rumble of thunder increased her fear. "Please," she screamed, desperately begging him for mercy. "I'll do anything you want. Just make it stop." "Everything?" He grinned, looking down at her. "It's too late for deals. You should have thought earlier." At that moment, the train burst into her field of vision, huge and merciless. Her horse bucked even harder, rearing up on its hind legs as if in a last-ditch effort to escape, but the rope held firm. The woman closed her eyes, but that didn't spare her the sound. A deafening metallic thud, the animal's screams, the cracking of bones, the deafening echo that echoed across the road. When she opened her eyes, all that remained was a blood stain and the mangled form of her horse scattered along the tracks. Her heart froze. Her breath hitched, then came out in sobs that shook her body. Bryant looked at the scene with a stone face. Then he turned to her and said calmly, as if nothing had happened, "Now you know what the real world looks like." He turned and walked to his car, leaving her in her wheelchair in front of the shattered fate and bloody chaos he himself had created. The video, shot by a random driver who happened to be nearby, spread across social media like a fire that couldn't be put out. The footage of a woman in a wheelchair screaming and begging to stop the train while a Bryant police officer stood by, indifferently watching the tragedy, shocked the public. The rails, the bloodstains, and the horse's mangled body became symbols of cruelty, causing waves of outrage. However, the reaction was far from unequivocal. As always, society was divided. On one hand, people demanded immediate punishment for Bryant. Social media was flooded with hashtags like #JusticeForWoman and #JusticeBryant. Hate-filled comments appeared under the video. "This man is not a cop. He's a monster. How could he? Tie a horse to the tracks in front of a woman in a wheelchair. That's out of line. Where is the humanity? We must get justice." But there were those who sided with Bryant. Some justified his actions, saying that he was just doing his job. The comments were full of racist and derogatory remarks. If she knew her place, nothing would have happened. Cops protect order. Maybe he wanted to teach her a lesson, but who knows what she did? You don't know the whole story. Maybe she provoked it herself. Every news channel covered the story, inviting experts, activists, and former police officers to discuss it. The atmosphere in the studios was tense. One former officer who supported Bryant stated, "He acted according to the circumstances. The woman may have provoked him, and he chose a way to force her into submission." To which a human rights activist exclaimed, "Forcing compliance? By tying a horse to the rails in front of a woman in a wheelchair? That's sadism, not justice." Meanwhile, the woman at the center of the tragedy sat in her wheelchair, surrounded by several advocates who helped her cope with her psychological trauma. She refused to speak to reporters, her silence louder than any words. The only phrase she said to her lawyers was, "This man must answer for what he did," but the pain I went through will never be forgotten. Meanwhile, Bryant found himself in the spotlight. He was called in for an internal investigation, but he maintained an icy calm in a television interview. "My actions were dictated by the situation," he said. "Sometimes we police officers have to make tough decisions. This was one of them." His words only fueled the people's anger. "Hard decision?" shouted the anchor on the live broadcast. "Tying a horse to a rail to prove your power is not a hard decision. It's a crime." But Bryant had supporters. There were voices on social media and at rallies justifying what he did. She fought back. It was her choice. "Police officers risk their lives for us. Sometimes you have to be tough." "Why are we even discussing this? She's just a woman in a wheelchair. What could she possibly know about law and order?" These words divided the community more and more. Activists organized protests demanding Bryant's immediate arrest. In major cities, placards read, "No more police violence," and "Justice for the weak." At the same time, counter-meetings were held in provincial cities with slogans such as "Let's support our officers" and "Law and order first." The fate of Bryant and the woman was now on a scale that was swayed by public opinion. One camp called for punishment, the other for protection. But no one could remain indifferent to this story, which opened an abyss at the heart of a society where racism, cruelty, and indifference had become an everyday occurrence. The tragedy was just beginning. Before we continue, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from and whether something similar has happened in your life. We'd love your feedback and thoughts. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation of this exciting story. And now, we continue. The rumble of public outrage was loud, but there was an ominous silence behind the closed doors of the police department. Officer Bryant, sitting at his desk, clutched a plastic cup of coffee in his hands, staring at one point. His face remained stone-faced, but a hurricane raged inside him. He realized the situation was out of control. This was more than just a conflict on the road. The video that had spread online had put him in jeopardy. Now, his every move, his every action was under scrutiny. But he wasn't about to lose. Bryant was sure that all he had to do was play his cards right and he would emerge victorious. He began by trying to undermine the woman's credibility. In one of the reports he wrote immediately after the incident, he called her aggressive and conflict-provoking. There, he also claimed her behavior posed a potential threat to public safety. He mentioned that she refused to show identification for her horse and was interfering with the duties of a police officer. These words were inscribed with such equanimity that, reading them, one could believe the lies he had concocted. But he didn't stop there. Bryant used his connections in the department to find additional information on the woman. Her past was examined under a magnifying glass. Every minor infraction or overdue fine was turned into a weapon. "She's irresponsible," he told his co-workers. "People like her always cause trouble." It wasn't the first time Bryant had resorted to such methods. His confidence in his own impunity grew with each year of service. He knew he had support, those who, like him, saw the world through the lens of power and division. Another step was to work with the video. He contacted technicians he knew well to try to tweak the chest camera footage. The bits where he ties the horse to the rail had to disappear, or at least look less obvious. "She was hysterical," he explained. "I tried to calm her down. You saw for yourself that she was inadequate." He did his best to portray himself as a hero who tried to prevent tragedy, but found himself unjustly condemned by society. However, the investigators who took up the case were persistent. They questioned Bryant, and he, straining all his nerves, lied with icy calm. He repeated that the woman had threatened his authority and was trying to create havoc. He claimed that her horse was aggressive and that he was allegedly trying to protect her himself. She threw a tantrum and I acted as I should have, he insisted, adding dramatic details to his story. In the meantime, the woman's lawyers began to gather evidence of her innocence. They provided paperwork for the horse proving it was her property, and provided medical reports showing that the woman was confined to a wheelchair due to a progressive disease that made her unable to be a physical threat. They gathered testimony from witnesses, including the driver who took the video, who confirmed that he saw Bryant tie the horse to the rail. Still, it was difficult. People supporting Bryant used her wheelchair as an excuse to humiliate her. "She's just looking for attention," they wrote in the comments. "A wheelchair is no excuse for provocation." It was part of a massive campaign to discredit the woman, which Bryant tacitly supported. His supporters actively spread false rumors that she was homeless, that she had previously participated in protests, that her disability was allegedly exaggerated. It was a targeted attack to portray her as an unreliable witness. At some point, however, the evidence began to pile up against him. The public outcry intensified, and even those who had previously defended Bryant began to ask questions. Unofficial reports surfaced from his former co-workers who mentioned that Bryant had always been known for his violent nature. One of his former partners told reporters anonymously that he often humiliated people on calls, especially if they were minorities or people with disabilities. "He liked to feel powerful," she said. "He loved to watch people lose control under his pressure." Bryant felt his world crumbling, but he continued to stand his ground. He assured everyone around him that the truth was on his side and that this was all a witch hunt. He knew that if he admitted his guilt, he would lose everything: his job, his reputation, his sense of power, which was everything to him. He was willing to lie, manipulate, and use every opportunity to hide the truth. But the truth, like the train he couldn't stop, was coming closer and closer to him. The nights had become her enemies. Every time she closed her eyes, she went back to that unfortunate day. She saw Bryant coldly tying her horse to the track, heard the rumble of the approaching train, felt her arms weakening from unsuccessful attempts to get the wheelchair closer to the rope. And over again, like a vicious cycle, the sound of the impact, the sound that changed her life forever, echoed in her mind. She woke up in a cold sweat, her body shivering, but not from the cold, but from helplessness. The nightmare haunted her every night, plunging her into an abyss of despair. But there was another fire burning in her heart, the fire of anger. Anger at the man who had stolen from her the last thing she loved. The horse was her companion, her only friend, her symbol of freedom. Even confined to a wheelchair due to a progressive disease that robbed her of the ability to walk, she found solace in riding along with the horse on these desolate roads. It was the few things that gave her a sense of life. Now she had nothing left. She sat at the window of her small apartment, framed by old, peeling frames, staring into the void. Her wheelchair stood next to the bed she often couldn't get to without help. She remembered her horse, the softness of its fur, the warmth of its breath, the sound of its hooves pounding on the gravel. The horse was the only creature that didn't look at her with pity. They were partners, equals, and it was the only place she felt human. But now it's been taken away, taken away by someone who didn't even think she was worthy of being heard. He looked at her as if she were something dirty, something unworthy of his attention. Just a mistake of nature. His words echoed in her head like a venomous whisper that there was no way she could drown out. She knew that Bryant was not alone in his views. To many people like him, she was just a woman in a wheelchair, unable to fend for herself. Her existence was a challenge to their cruel world, and that world did not tolerate weakness. But she was determined to fight. Despite the fear, despite the humiliation she endured, despite the whispers behind her back, she knew she had to get justice. It wasn't just for her, but for her horse, for everyone who found themselves in a position where their voices were being ignored. She turned to lawyers, but every visit to the office was an ordeal. She saw the people in the hallways looking at her. Their gazes were a mixture of pity and contempt. They looked at her wheelchair as a label for her weakness. They didn't see her pain, her determination, her strength. She heard whispers behind her back. What is she trying to prove? It's just an animal. Why all the fuss? But she didn't let those words penetrate her soul. Every meeting with the lawyers reminded her that the system she was trying to beat was designed for people like Bryant. They warned her that proving his guilt would be difficult. He has connections. He has a reputation, they said. You need to be prepared for him to try to smear you. But she already knew that. She'd seen comments online calling her a provocateur, a liar, a weak woman just looking for attention. Some even questioned her disability, calling her a faker. Each such comment was a blow, but she stood her ground. She knew the truth was on her side. She still had nightmares, still heard the sound of the approaching train, still felt her heart breaking with the pain of loss. But now the nightmare had become her weapon. She was no longer running away from it, but using it to remind herself why she had no right to give up. Her fight was only the beginning, and she knew she wouldn't back down. Even if the whole world was against her, she would go all the way. For justice, for the memory of her horse, for herself. It seemed that the thunder Bryant had relied on to intimidate those around him was now falling on him. At first, it was only faint blows, like the distant murmur of a thunderstorm. Articles appeared in the local press. Police officer accused of abusing woman in wheelchair. Then the murmur turned into a hurricane. Front-page headlines on major news outlets began screaming, "Power and brutality. Police officer under investigation for an act of sadism." Reports showed footage of the very day he, stone-faced, tied a horse to the railroad tracks. His image was on display for all to see and for all to condemn. His superiors, who initially tried to keep the case quiet, quickly changed their tone as soon as the public demanded action. Official statements sounded cold-blooded, as if they themselves were not part of the system that had allowed him to do his deeds with impunity for so long. We always stand for honesty and professionalism. The case will be investigated to the fullest extent of the law. But behind those words was just a desire to get rid of a troubled officer. Bryant had become a liability, a stain that threatened the department's reputation. Summoned to internal affairs, he sat at a long table under the stares of the investigators. For the first time in his life, his voice trembled. Until a few weeks ago, he would have laughed in the face of those who dared question his actions. But now his confidence had evaporated. He was being asked questions he couldn't answer. Why did he stay where he was when the woman in the wheelchair begged him to stop? Why had he decided to tie the horse to the tracks in the first place? Why did obvious contradictions appear in his report? He knew it was useless to lie anymore, but the truth was too dangerous for him. "I acted in the interest of order," he repeated over and over like a mantra. But his words sounded hollow, even to himself. At home, things were even worse. His wife, who had once been proud of his form, now looked at him with contempt. "How could you?" Her words were like a spit in his face. She no longer spoke to him, avoided his gaze as if he were an infected ulcer that would only grow. Their children, teenagers who had recently told their friends with admiration that their father was a policeman, now avoided mentioning his name. They were teased at school, their view of a world where their father was a hero shattered. Neighbors no longer said hello to him, and sometimes looked at him with open contempt. Someone left a note on his car that read, "Monster." One night, someone threw a brick through the window of their house. His wife screamed at him, accusing him of ruining their lives. "You turned us into outcasts," she said. "You always thought only of yourself." But the biggest blow was the way his co-workers began to avoid him. They didn't express their contempt openly, but Bryant could feel it. The jokes he used to exchange with his partners turned to icy silence. He was excluded from all informal conversations. No one sat next to him in the mess hall. He had become a ghost in the building where not so long ago he walked with his head held proudly high. He heard whispers behind his back. He got what he deserved. Even those who had once supported his cruelty now distanced themselves for fear of being dragged into the scandal. But that was just the beginning. When the case went to trial, his lawyer, hired in a desperate attempt to salvage something, didn't even hide his pessimism. "We don't have much of a chance," he said. "The evidence is too strong." The video, the witness testimony, the contradictions in his reports, it all became a trap he couldn't get out of. The prosecutor was merciless, portraying him as a sadist who used his uniform to demonstrate power. The accusations of racism were the loudest. The woman's lawyers emphasized how he humiliated her for her disability, how he insulted her as a human being. They presented recordings of him calling her a mistake of nature and trash on the side of the road. Those words he spoke that day were the final nail in his career and reputation. His wife filed for divorce, taking the children. His house was put up for sale to cover mounting legal expenses. He had lost his uniform, his badge, his power. But worst of all was the contempt he felt in every look, every whisper behind his back. He had become the man everyone hated. And, alone in his empty apartment, he couldn't help but wonder, was it worth it? Was his desire to humiliate a woman in a wheelchair worth destroying his life? But there was no answer. Only the emptiness that was growing inside him, devouring whatever was left. The world stopped for each of them, but the silence of that stop was different. A woman in a wheelchair sat in her room, surrounded by the emptiness that had become her constant companion. Her horse, her only friend, had been destroyed before her eyes, and that memory haunted her like an indelible stain on her soul. The pain of the loss was deeper than anything she could imagine, and the sense of injustice lodged in her heart grew daily. Despite winning in court, she didn't feel like a winner. Yes, Bryant had lost everything: his job, his family, his position. Yes, his name had become a symbol of shame, and each new day brought him the humiliation he'd previously inflicted on others himself. But none of it gave her back what she had lost. Not her horse, not the dignity he had taken from her by his words and actions, not her faith in humanity. She remained a woman in a wheelchair, thrown into a world that viewed her through the prism of her weakness. Her health was deteriorating. The disease that had confined her to a wheelchair was progressing. She felt her body failing her more and more, every movement becoming more difficult. But worst of all was the heartache. Deep down, she knew that the justice she had achieved was not enough. There was no getting the horse back. The lost sense of security, the fragile peace she had found in her walks, could not be restored. Every day now seemed like a battle, and she was on the verge of defeat. But despite that, she continued to live. She knew that if she surrendered, it would mean a victory for the likes of Bryant. Her existence became a protest in itself. She became a symbol for those who were also experiencing injustice. Articles were dedicated to her story. She was invited to speeches where she talked about how one mistake could destroy lives. She talked about her horse, about the pain, about the system that allows people like Bryant to feel omnipotent. But when she returned home, she was alone again. Alone with her wheelchair and her memories. And somewhere in another part of town, Bryant was sitting. His face was gaunt, his shoulders slumped. He no longer resembled the man who stood at the railroad tracks with a mocking smile on his face. His world had crumbled, and the wreckage of that world was pressing down on him with every passing second. He hadn't just lost his job, his family, and the respect of those around him. He had lost himself. Every night he saw her face, the face of a woman in a wheelchair, covered in tears, her screams, her attempts to save her horse. He heard the sound of the approaching train over and over again. That sound haunted him even in the silence. He woke up shivering, his heart pounding, and in that moment he realized that he would never be able to get rid of that memory again. He tried to find solace in alcohol, but it only made the pain worse. He tried blaming the system, the circumstances, even the woman herself. But none of these attempts helped him escape the truth. It was all his fault. He knew it was. He had seen how his choices, his cruelty, had ruined not only her life, but his own. But what terrified him most of all was the thought that none of it could be undone. His only companions now were silence and guilt. Sometimes he would sit at the window of his small rented apartment, look at the people passing by and think, "How did I get to this point?" The answer was always the same. He had gotten to this point because he thought he was superior, because his racism and cruelty had made him blind to other people's pain. But realizing this did not bring relief. This story didn't have a happy ending. It couldn't have one. For the woman in the wheelchair, every day became a struggle to survive in a world that continued to look at her as someone unworthy. For Bryant, each day became a punishment he assigned to himself. The two lives that collided on the tracks that fateful day were shattered forever. But maybe this tragedy has become a lesson for others. Maybe someone hearing this story will think twice before humiliating someone else. Maybe this mistake, so terrible and unredeemable, will still do at least a little good. Or maybe it's just another example of how the world keeps spinning on without noticing the broken lives in its path. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you experienced racism or injustice in your life? We appreciate each and every one of you, and your thoughts are incredibly important to us. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like to support us and not miss new stories. We wish you a good day and only positive emotions.